Pulling an engine seems like one of the most intimidating things you can do on a car, especially if you've never done it before. But today, I'm going to use this video to show you what the process is actually like, and hopefully help you gauge if it's something you feel comfortable attempting. So why did I bother pulling my engine anyway? Well, this is my 1999 Miata with over 130,000 miles on it. After enjoying the car for about 3 years and taking it to various track and autocross events, my cylinder head developed a crack, causing my coolant to magically disappear. With almost all of my seals leaking and relatively poor compression test numbers, this seemed like the perfect time for an engine rebuild. As an added bonus, having the engine apart also made for the perfect time to install some upgrades to be ready for forced induction later on. In this video, I'll share the overall process I followed, special tools I needed, as well as any issues I ran into and how I got around them, in the hopes of inspiring some confidence in you should you want to attempt this yourself. That being said, this video will be more of a high-level summary aimed at those of you that don't really know what goes into pulling and reinstalling an engine. If you're looking for a more in-depth guide, I've linked several in the description that really help me out. With all of that out of the way, let's talk a little more about the overall difficulty of this job. Pulling an engine, especially on a Miata, didn't prove to be nearly as difficult as I thought it would be. Now don't get me wrong, if an oil change is the extent of your wrenching experience, you might want to save this one for a professional, or enlist some mechanically inclined friends to help you out. But if you have a good amount of experience working on things like suspension, brakes, and other maintenance items on your car, and you don't mind contorting yourself into weird positions, pulling an engine really won't be that hard for you. At the end of the day, we can break it down into a few main steps to follow. You're going to start by disconnecting anything that connects the engine to the car. This could be things like hoses, your wiring harness, and other mechanical connections like motor mounts, your drive shaft, or your transmission. Next, you're going to drain all of your fluids. And lastly, you're going to connect your engine hoist and pull it out. Now I know all of that is a large oversimplification of the process, but as long as you're careful and take your time, I promise you it really isn't that hard. Now let's get into the tools you'll need to actually get the engine out of the car. First up is an engine hoist. Make sure you get one that is rated for the weight of your engine, or engine and transmission combination if you're pulling both at the same time. Even though 2 tons is way overkill for a Miata engine and transmission, I went with the 2-ton version since it has enough reach to grab the engine without taking off the front bumper. You'll also want one of these load levelers, which makes maneuvering the engine much easier since it allows you to tilt the engine forward and backward to help clear things. I've heard of people doing it without one of these, but they're not that expensive, so I would save yourself the frustration and go ahead and get one. If you're going to be working on the engine once it's out of the car, you'll also want an engine stand. Once again, make sure you get one which is rated for the weight of your engine. Along with this, you may need to buy bolts to connect it to the engine. Some people end up using the bell housing bolts to attach their engine to the stand, but in my case I found them to be a little too short, so I ordered bolts of the same spec with a longer length off of McMaster-Carr. When you're doing this, make sure you buy quality bolts, either class 10.9 if they're metric, or something like a grade 8 if you're using standard. If your engine is going to be sitting for a while, the last thing you want to do is support it 2.5 feet off the ground with cheap hardware. Alright, we've got our tools, so let's get a little bit more into detail on each of the overall steps I listed out earlier. Don't forget that even though I'm doing this on a Miata, the general process can really apply to just about any car. First, you'll need to get your car off the ground. You're going to need some room to crawl around underneath and disconnect things, so somewhere between 15 to 20 inches of ground clearance is probably what you're after. You can use 4 jack stands or a set of quick jacks like these. The next thing you'll want to do is run your fuel pump out of fuel, so there is as little fuel as possible left over in the line heading up to your fuel rail. This will keep you safe when disconnecting your fuel line later on, and prevent you from pouring gas all over your engine bay. The easiest way to do this is to find your fuel pump relay and unplug it while the car is running. This will disable the fuel pump and cause it to stop sending fuel to the engine. On my NB Miata, it's a connector just under the steering column, so all I did was start the car, yank the plug, and wait for the engine to die. Now that you've taken safety precautions about gas, we're going to do the same thing in terms of electricity. Since you'll be unplugging a good portion of your car's wiring harness, it's a good idea to disconnect the negative lead to your car's battery. With that out of the way, start simple. Remove any larger components in the engine bay that are attached to the engine, or any larger components that might get in your way. This will include things like your intake assembly, any plastic undertrays, and your radiator. In the case of Miatas, you'll also want to remove the coil pack to help you access things and avoid whacking it on the firewall later. I found this one out the hard way. Next, we'll move on to any accessory belts at the front of the engine. On my car, there are two. One which spins the alternator and the water pump, and the other which connects to the AC compressor and power steering pump. The alternator and water pump belt was able to be left on, since those components are directly attached to the engine, while the AC and power steering belt needed to be removed, since I didn't want to completely disconnect these systems from the car. Instead of making a mess and dumping harmful chemicals into the environment, you can simply unbolt the AC compressor and the power steering pump and secure them out of the way with bungee cords. Make sure you don't put any stress on the lines and never hang the components directly by the lines themselves. You can secure the bungee cords to things in the engine bay like bolts, any existing holes, or your strut towers. Now that you've cleared up some space in the engine bay, it should be easier to see what still has to be removed. In my case, it was things like heater hoses, more wiring harness connectors, and the throttle cable. As a quick tip for dealing with wiring harness connectors, it's a good idea to label them with masking tape. Even though car manufacturers usually do a good job of making sure that connectors are differently shaped, and you can't put the square peg in the round hole, so to speak, labeling the connectors, especially if it's your first time pulling an engine, will give you some confidence later on when all of the wiring harness is pulled back. Another thing you won't want to forget on any car are ground wires, which ground electrical connections on the engine to the chassis. On my Miata, there is a ground strap tucked away next to the dipstick. Assuming you've disconnected all of the mechanical items and wiring holding your engine back up top, let's get under the car and take a look at what we need to take care of underneath. Depending on the car you're working on, it may be easier to remove the engine with the transmission attached. In my opinion, that's definitely the case with Miatas, so that's what we'll be doing here. Even though it may seem like more work, you'll have easy access to your clutch and transmission seals, and it also prevents you from having to reach between the firewall for the bell housing bolts, which are already prone to snapping. In this case, it's a matter of playing the same game that we did with the engine, of finding anything connected to the transmission or in the way of it, and removing it. First, you'll need to remove your exhaust so you can access the drive shaft and the power plant frame, or PPF as it's known. On Miatas, this is the part that holds your transmission to the vehicle. Exhaust bolts are definitely also prone to snapping, so you'll want to use something like PB Blaster and let them soak for some time, especially if you plan on reusing your exhaust. If not, you can always get out your Sawzall and hack it apart, but in my case, I wanted to save my OEM exhaust so I could potentially sell it later. Depending on your engine, you may need to disconnect your header or headers, but on a Miata, you can leave it attached for easy access later. Once you've got the exhaust taken care of, you'll need to remove the drive shaft. On Miatas, you have 4 bolts with nuts and lock washers that hold the drive shaft to the differential flange. Be very careful and make sure you use the right size wrenches on these. With the flange in the way, you have really limited access, so take your time and be careful not to strip them. If you're working alone and need to prevent the drive shaft from spinning while you loosen the bolts, just throw your transmission into 5th or 6th gear to add some resistance. Then loosen the bolt you have access to, put the car in neutral, and you can spin the shaft to reach the next bolt. Once you've disconnected the flange, the drive shaft just slides backwards and out of the transmission. There's a couple things to note here. Remember when I mentioned draining fluids earlier? Make sure your transmission is drained before you remove the drive shaft, or you'll end up with a huge puddle of transmission fluid on the floor. Even if it is drained, some fluid will still seep out, So be ready and slip a plastic bag with an elastic band over the end of the transmission to keep the mess to a minimum. Something else worth doing is placing a few microfiber towels with some zip ties around the machined part of the shaft. This will prevent dirt from getting into the splines and will also prevent scratches on the sealing surface that could lead to fluid leaks. Now that the drive shaft is out of the way, we can finally get to the PPF. There are 3 bolts you need to loosen here, 2 long and 1 short, which are attached to the transmission. Support the transmission with a jack while you do this to be safe. Loosen and remove the bolts fully. Then you should be able to swing the PPF around and down past the transmission. It will want to droop, so you can support it with a jack stand to keep it level with the car. There's also several wiring connections to undo on the transmission, so make sure you don't miss any of those. If you're pulling your transmission with your engine, you probably realize that you'll need to remove the shifter as well. On my car, this just involved removing the center console, which is just a few Phillips screws, removing a large shift boot held in with 4 bolts, and then another 3 bolts to get the actual shifter out. This is a fantastic time to go ahead and order a shifter rebuild kit to get any play out of your shifter and make it feel brand new when you reassemble it. If you've done your final double and triple checks to make sure nothing is still connected to the engine and nothing remains but the fuel line, you're in pretty good shape. It's a good idea to save this step for last, since a little bit of gas will still spill out, even though we ran the pump out earlier. Disconnecting your fuel lines will again vary somewhat by car, but in the case of my NB Miata, I have a returnless fuel system, which means that there is just one line coming from the tank that goes into the fuel rail. It's joined intermediately at this piece here, which is a fuel pressure damper. So we can just disconnect it at the damper using the correct size fuel line disconnect tool. Have a bunch of rags ready around the area to soak up any fuel that comes out, and make sure you open any windows or doors if you're in a garage. Fuel vapor is very flammable, and you don't want that stuff sticking around in the air for too long. Using the tool, you'll need to squeeze the connector until the tabs move, allowing you to disconnect it. This can be tricky, so take your time and make sure you don't break the connector. Once you've disconnected the line, run some hose from the damper into a bottle, just to prevent any fuel that seeps out later from spilling. At this point, the only thing still connected should be your motor mounts, but don't remove those yet. Do a double, triple, quadruple.
Much later.
Check that nothing else is still connected, whether it be wiring, hoses, miscellaneous brackets, and so on. Now it's finally time to connect up your engine hoist. Miatas have these convenient lifting brackets already on the engine, but depending on your car, you may need to do some research on the best lifting points. As far as connecting the load leveler chains to the engine, I went with some of these chain quick links. You can get these at just about any hardware store for a few dollars each, so buy a couple that are rated for more than the weight of your engine, and that way you know you're safe. These just spin open and close by hand. Even though you can tighten them up with a wrench, there's really no need, as gravity will keep the chains in line. Connect the quick links and raise the hoist until the chains just start to get taut. Now that you have something else supporting the engine, we can finally free up the engine from the motor mounts. On Miatas, you just have a nut on either side in these circular cutouts in the front subframe. Once those nuts are undone, your engine and transmission will be fully supported by the hoist. It helps to have a friend under the car while you operate the hoist, in order to make sure you won't whack the engine or transmission into anything. The general motion you'll need to follow is up and forward, tilting the load leveler as you go to help clear things. Take your time here, go slow, and watch for anything that you could hit both above and below the car. You shouldn't feel any more resistance than you would using a regular floor jack, so if you do, stop and figure out what is still connected or what you might be hitting. Once your engine is finally free, I suggest putting it on a stand so you don't have to worry about supporting it. Never just put the engine on the ground, since it will be sitting directly on the oil pan, which in most cases is not designed to support its weight. And there you have it. Your engine is out, and you're ready to do whatever you want with it. I won't go into too much detail for this next section, but I did want to give a few pointers for reinstallation. Overall, the process really is pretty much just the reverse of removal. Start off by making sure you've done everything you want to your engine while it's out of the car. Replace anything that is inaccessible or tough to reach in the car now, or you'll kick yourself later. Think along the lines of things like any hoses or seals that might be difficult to reach. It's also a great time to get yourself a thread chaser set like this one. You can use the taps and dies that come in the set to clean up bolt holes and the bolts themselves before reinstallation. This is really important, as a bolt clogged up with rust and debris won't properly thread, which will impact tightening it and its torque spec. So if your car has any rust on it at all, I would say this is a must. Before getting the engine back in the car, I supported it on a crate that the rebuilder gave me so I could install the new clutch. To reconnect the transmission, a friend and I actually attached the engine hoist to the transmission with some chains, and used it to line up the transmission with the engine, so we wouldn't have to hold it. You can also use a floor jack to guide it in. If your transmission doesn't go in, don't force it, as your clutch disc is probably misaligned and you'll need to stop and fix that. The plastic alignment tools provided with most clutch kits are known to not have the best tolerances, and can cause this to happen. Once you're ready to put your engine back in, be extremely careful lowering it. If you have a Miata, save yourself the trouble and do it without the coil pack. As for the motor mounts, you'll want to aim to get the stud on the driver's side motor mount in first, as this is a hole rather than a slot. Once this one is in, the engine will likely have to rotate counterclockwise to slide into the slot on the mount on the passenger side. This took some persuading to get the alignment just right, and some people recommend something like a long 2x4 to push on the block and get it to seat. Once the engine seats properly, you'll be able to see it. Secure and torque the nuts on the motor mounts, reattach your PPF, and you can remove your hoist and get to work reinstalling everything. Again, take your time, don't forget any wires or grounds. So that just about wraps it up for this video. Hopefully it gives you some insight as to what's involved with pulling an engine, and if it's something you want to take on yourself. Overall, engine removal probably took between 15 and 20 hours total, taking my time over the course of a few Saturdays. Installation was maybe about the same. If you enjoyed the video or learned something new, please consider giving the video a like and subscribing to the channel. Also, drop me a comment on any additional tips you have for a job like this, or any questions you might have, and I'll do my best to help out. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.